Good evening, everyone. If I could ask you to take your seat. My name is Ernest Wilson. I'm Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, and I'm absolutely delighted to see you here this evening. This is a very important subject. It doesn't always receive the attention that it deserves, but those of us who really know what's going on understand and appreciate how important this topic is. I want to start off, of course, by thanking the John and James L. Knight Foundation for its generous support to make this evening possible. Yes, that's right. The Knight Foundation has been a leading foundation in doing all sorts of crazy things they shouldn't be doing, that other foundations aren't doing in the area of journalism and media. And we've been working closely with them, and we're delighted that they supported this event as part of the Carnegie Knight Initiative. I also want to thank Cindy Kennard. Where's Cindy? Cindy, there she is in the front row. Good. For her contribution to the report on information needs of communities. And we were able to send Cindy, who is one of our members of our community and does all sorts of great work at the Annenberg School, to the FCC, where she wrote several very important sections of that report. So I'm delighted to see her here this evening. And I think you worked with some students, if I'm not mistaken, in putting that together. Excellent. I also want to recognize and thank my colleague and friend who's come back from the right-hand coast to the left-hand coast, Adam Clayton Powell III, for his work in Washington. Adam, please stand up. Thank you, thank you. He worked in Washington in helping to set up the previous two events that led to this third event. And so I want to thank Adam, and Irene is here also, who is his better half, who came out with him on this trip. I've known Adam for 117 years, so it's a delight to see him back with us this evening. So what we're doing, this is part of a series of activities that are taking place over these 2 or 3 days. And the question that we're trying to address is, what is the meaning of diversity in a digital, distributed kind of environment? Does it change a lot? How do we understand it? How do we recognize and appreciate changes in technology? And I'll say a bit more about that toward the end of the evening. But I also want to take this opportunity to thank I call her the Energizer Bunny. And you all know who I'm talking about. That can only be Corolla Weil. Please stand up. She's probably out there. There she is, taking notes. I want to thank her. She now runs our Washington office and really is the one who really made this happen. So the question is how to engender civic engagement across all platforms of the media and across all dimensions of diverse populations. And so, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, we're seeing a tremendous diversification of the demographics in the United States, on the one hand, at the same time that we also see a diversification of platforms, on the other hand. And so how do these two things interact with one another? And for many years, USC Annenberg has been developing a comprehensive program of research, teaching, and public service that tries to deepen our understanding of these dynamics, both on the technology side and, as importantly, and perhaps more importantly, on the social side, both in terms of the legacy media, the traditional media, as well as new media platforms. And so I'm just going to rattle off some of the things that we're doing. You know, there's no free lunch. And so I want to, this is a nonprofit organization, but in the spirit of NPR, PBS, et cetera, brought to you by Professor Stacy Smith's research on portrayals of males and females in popular media. Her work looks at the reasons for underrepresentation and hypersexualization of girls and women in movies, television, games, and advertising, and is absolutely stunning and shocking, her results. They were reported recently in USA Today. The number of women who occupy leading roles in movies and television has not changed in 15 years. There are always sidekicks, somebody's wife, somebody's girlfriend, but the number of women who are occupying these central roles has really not changed. It's shocking. I also want to mention Intersections, which is the South Los Angeles Report, which is a community news site and newsletter. It's dedicated to covering South Los Angeles and the surrounding areas, especially working with our high school populations. And our students go into the high schools and work with these students. You know, the definition of diversity is changing as America becomes more diverse. Professor Diane Winston, who's on our faculty, holds the Knight Chair in Media and Religion and teaches courses that examine religion as it relates to journalism, visual media, etc. And her current research project includes media coverage of Islam, religion, and new media, and the place of religion in American politics, which we see every day in the run-up to the presidential election. I also want to mention our Metamorphosis research project and the Alhambra Study, which looks at a very diverse local community and tries to understand the ways that different elements of those community, Anglos and Hispanics and Asian Americans and African, use media in different ways and have different hierarchies of their preferred media choice. And I could go on and on and on, and since I'm a professor, I'll only give myself another 90 minutes to do that this evening. But that's not why we are all here this evening. So to start this evening's discussion, we're going to refer to a very important report. If you have not read it, especially the students in the audience, if you have not read it, it's hugely important. It's called The Information Needs of Communities, the Changing Media Landscape in a Broadband Age. And I think it's safe to say that this is one of the most widely read and deeply appreciated reports of the American media. It's a very, very important analysis of the way that different parts of the media environment fit together in today's topsy-turvy media world. The author of that report, Steve Waldman, is editor-in-chief, president, and co-founder of BeliefNet, which deals with issues of religion and media, et cetera, et cetera. Before co-founding BeliefNet in 1999, he was a political journalist, serving as national editor of U.S. News and World Report and national correspondent for Newsweek. I think he's now doing hyper-local stuff in his native village of Brooklyn, I think. And I have to say that wearing another hat, Steve and I would spend some long hours together talking about these issues, especially on the public broadcasting side. And he was always a good listener and a good collaborator in thinking about these important issues. And so I want to really thank Steve for coming this evening. After Steve speaks, then I'm going to invite the other panel participants to take their place on stage. But I want to welcome Steve to the left-hand coast and invite him to come up and share his wisdom with us. Steve, the podium is yours.
It is really true that Annenberg touched this report in a number of different ways throughout, in addition to, as Professor Wilson mentioned, that Cindy Kennard wrote what I think is one of the most important chapters in the report about local TV, news, and radio. And Dean Wilson was also a sometimes subtle, sometimes aggressive counsel on all matters public broadcasting related, which was an important part of this study. Ellen Goodman from Rutgers, who's also here, was another important player in writing that section of the report. And the report basically was started, instigated at a moment a few years ago when things were very confusing. Not that they're not anymore, but you basically had, on the one hand, you had newspapers shutting down right and left. There was a period when there was active discussion about whether the New York Times was going to go out of business, and it really looked like the floor had fallen out from traditional media. On the other hand, we had this incredible boom of exciting, creative, new types of media on the internet. You had, meanwhile, a kind of comic sniping between the leadership of these two different, the old and the new, the old media folks saying that the new media people were all just a bunch of people in their pajamas, mouthing off their opinions without doing any reporting, and the pajama-clad bloggers saying that the old media people were just dinosaurs who didn't have any idea that they were obsolete. So the chairman of the FCC said in December of 2009, we need to sort through this. We need to have a real understanding of what should we be worried about in this time of incredible change, and how might this affect public policy. And you know, I think part of what we learned from this is that this is not a black and white situation. You have there are positive and negative trends happening at the same time, and sorting them through and really understanding that was part of the challenge and part of understanding what's really going on. You see the same thing actually when you talk about matters of diversity. In some ways, it is a kind of best of times, worst of times situation. You know, by some of the traditional measures, things are really going backwards. Minority employment, for instance, in 2007, there were 7,400 minorities working at newspapers. By 2010, that was down to 5,300. Minority ownership. Well, African Americans comprise about 13% of the population. They comprise 0.33% of the ownership of stations. Same basic statistics for Latinos. So by the traditional measures, not only are things bad, but they're getting worse. On the other hand, you have this new media construct that has very low barriers to entry. So many of the ways that traditional media have blocked out diverse viewpoints and minority viewpoints is actually eroding. And one of the things that most surprised us when we were doing this report is how minority communities are actually ahead of the population in the adoption of some technologies. So, for instance, according to Pew, African Americans are more likely to have created their own web content by blogging, microblogging, or social networking. About a quarter of the people on Twitter are African American, which is approximately double the population as a whole, and on and on. And this is very interesting and unusual because it's not, I don't think, in the history of American media, the norm that when new technologies come in, they have higher penetration in minority communities at first. It usually lags. So it's very interesting and I think significant. But there again, okay, what do we make of all that? So you have some pluses and some minuses. I'm not going to go through all of the different ways we slice this in the report, but I want to hone in on one thing, which it especially relates to the topic of diversity, which is that I think we need to think not only in terms of diversity of voices, but also in terms of the adequacy of reporting. And that's a distinction that I'm going to come back to. I think in the olden days, in the ancient times, 2 or 3 years ago, analyzing whether there was a diversity of voices could be seen as a kind of a proxy for general health of a community. Now you can actually have a situation where you have diverse voices and you have a proliferation of media platforms, and yet you still have gaps in the type of information that's being provided. To try to get a handle on this, we first looked at newspapers, and you know the basic story. My favorite statistic is that, I think sometimes people think, oh, well, if newspapers only got with the program and got web savvier, they wouldn't be in this pickle. And I wish it were that simple, but it's really not. So from 2005 to 2009, newspapers' online traffic actually doubled from 1.6 billion page views to 3 billion page views. Sounds like a lot. And in fact, revenue did go up by $716 million during that period, went up for newspaper online revenue. And that sounds pretty impressive until you hear that during that same period, ad revenue on the print vehicles went down by $22.6 billion. So it went up by $716 million, down by $22.6 billion. Now, why that matters, I think, is mostly what effects it had on staff, what effect it had on repertorial capacity. On average, newsrooms dropped by about 25%, but many newsrooms were cut in half. On average, newspaper staffing is now at about the level it was before Watergate. You can see how this plays out in different cities. So Pew did a study of Baltimore. They found 32% fewer stories in 2009 than in 1999. A study of Philadelphia found the same thing. They say, quote, available news about public affairs issues has dramatically diminished over 3 years by measures of news hole, airtime, story count, and keyword measurement. A study of Raleigh-Durham looked at the News Observer as a case study. In 2004, the News Observer had 250 newsroom employees. By February of 2011, so that's just 7 years later, it had gone from 250 down to 103. Beats that lost reporters: courts, schools, legal affairs, agriculture, environment, state education. State House coverage has been really hit hard. So at a time when state spending has gone up by 20%, state coverage has gone down by a third. Investigative reporting we looked at, it's a little hard to get your hands on it because it's people have different definitions, but for instance, a few clues. And membership in the Investigative Reporters and Editors Association in 2003 was 5,400. 2010 it was 4,000. Submissions to the Pulitzer Prize Public Service Committee dropped 43% from 1984 to 2010. Coverage of Washington, which I used to do, 27 states have no Washington reporters. The numbers of papers with bureaus down by about a half since the mid-1980s. My old beat, religion, when I asked the Deborah Mason at the Religious News Writers Association what had happened since I left BeliefNet, and she said, oh, religion news at the local level is nearly gone. Now, in a lot of cases, what happens is beats aren't entirely eliminated. It's that the reporters are spread more thin. Someone who's covering 2 counties will now be covering 4 counties, or if they were doing 1 story a day, they'll now do a story a day and a blog post and tweet. Columbia Journalism Review referred to this as life on the hamster wheel, which I thought was a great description. But this being a government report, we tried to bureaucratize it and talked about the hamsterization of American journalism. And as cute as that image is, it really reflects some serious issues. And if you really look at not just these kind of aggregate numbers, but really important local issues, you can see it. So health coverage, crucially important topic. The Kaiser Foundation did a study just on health coverage and concluded that interest in health reporting is up, the number of health reporters is down, and that this has led to, quote, a loss in in-depth enterprise and policy-related stories. Education, again, one of the most important things that local newspapers do. You would think that if anything were held sacrosanct and protected, it would be schools reporting. Richard Colvin of the Hechinger Institute, which studies education reporters, said, put a great nuance on it, which he said, local coverage is likely not dropped in volume, but it has certainly dropped in ambition. Those who cover education may not do so full-time and don't have the leeway to write much of substance. So in other words, to use the metaphor we use a lot in this report, the media landscape, there are more and more ways to look out at the landscape and describe what you might see, but there are fewer and fewer people with less and less time to turn over the rocks or look in the shadows. And what that led to is a little bit of a surprising finding, given the attention that has appropriately been given to the Twitter revolution, the effect of social media on in the Mideast, or even locally here. You tend to have the sense that the social media and the internet revolution in general is all about empowering people and has a tremendous empowering effect, and it often is the case. But what we found also was that it has ushered in a countervailing shift at the same time, a shift of power away from citizens toward institutions in many cases. The Pew study of Baltimore really nailed it. They said, quote, as news is posted faster, often with little enterprise reporting added, the official version of events is becoming more important, though not often noted as such. Government, at least in this study, initiates most of the news. Or as one PR professional explained to us, newsrooms have been gutted, and particularly at the local level, journalists rely on press releases to help them fill their ever-increasing news hole. So we have, on the one hand, the powerful ways that Twitter has helped democratize things. On the other hand, I would argue a shift of power away from citizens towards powerful institutions. One of the problems with this report, and with any look at something like that, is how do you prove that this matters? And part of it is the difficulty of proving a negative. How do you show what reporting is not happening? And that was a real task. Now, there were a few indirect measures that will be familiar. The Bell California case, for one, was, I thought, an interesting example because it did eventually get covered. You all know the case of the chief administrative officer who got paid $800,000. LA Times eventually broke that story, won a Pulitzer Prize for it. But they broke it 5 or 6 years after the practice had started. So the people of Bell, California, a working class community, essentially lost about $5.6 million that wouldn't have been lost if there were even one reporter covering the Bell City Council on a regular basis. I like that example because it provides a nice, good, crisp cost-benefit study for why having reporters can actually pay big dividends. Another example might be the mine disaster in West Virginia, the Upper Big Branch mine disaster. Another case where there had been excellent reporting done by the Washington Post and a number of other publications that found 1,300 different safety violations at this mine, all on the record, all on public record. The problem is this reporting happened after the accident that killed 29 people. And so we are left to wonder what would have happened if the reporting had been done before the accident. And I guess I was probably most touched by people, not so much journalists, but people in the communities that are trying to figure out ways of solving community problems, who talked about what happens when you're trying to solve a problem and the media ecosystem dries up or there isn't information. In Michigan, for instance, an expert on the family courts told us that the coverage of the juvenile courts had gotten, quote, smaller and smaller over the years. And we said, okay, why does that matter? Give us some examples. Why does that matter? And he said, oh, well, the result is, quote, parents whose rights are terminated, who shouldn't be terminated. It just takes somebody to go down there to get the story, but nobody is ever down there. So if you can imagine as a parent or anyone else that the consequences of lack of coverage are really very severe. Now, I focus mostly on newspapers. I'm not going to spend as much time going through the other media, but very, very quickly, local TV news. The best study of local TV news is done here at USC at the Lear Center. One of the things that we found is that the actual amount of coverage has gone up by 35%, and this is a really important point, which is that you can no longer judge the health of a local media system by how many hours of news they produce. If you go by the number of hours or minutes, we are in a golden age of local TV news. We have never been better. It's up 35%. The problem is that when you dig down a little bit, you find that it's not exactly a golden age. Bleeding is still leading. 1 out of 3 LA broadcasts still leads with a crime story. And I think it was a USC study that had provided my single favorite fact about local TV news, which was that a quarter of the crime stories in the LA market were from out of town. So if you didn't happen to have a murder that day, they imported it from somewhere else. Local TV network news staff down by half since the late 1980s. News magazines where I used to work, reporting staff down by half. Radio. National radio formats actually have been growing. but the number of all news local radio stations has dropped from 50 in the 1980s to 30 now. So again, national's fine, local is declining. Cable news, similar thing. There was a brief moment where it looked like cable businesses were going to really invest heavily in local news. That has now basically plateaued, and in most communities starting to recede, so that is not going to be the solution. The general proliferation, at the same time that you have reporting cutbacks, you do have an increase in the number of outlets. And this has been one of the things that has been most confusing about this whole debate, because I've just given you all these examples where we have shortages. And yet, you kind of look around and you sort of, in most media markets, it's hard to feel like there's a shortage of media. We're awash in media. And that's why it's really important to get precise about what are we awash in and what are our shortages, because they're happening at the same time. You really have to dig a little bit deeper. So Pew did a study, actually the same study of Baltimore was a very telling one. They found 53 different news outlets. That's a lot of outlets, way more than there used to be. So it would seem like the city was not suffering any shortage of journalism, but then they did a content analysis and they concluded that 95% of the stories, including those in the new media, were based on reporting done by the traditional media, mostly the Baltimore Sun and one of the TV stations. And those sources were doing less than they used to. And there have been a number of studies that have basically shown the same thing. And you can see it, it's not exactly a surprise from your own reading of the web, that a lot of what is on the web is analysis and regurgitation of original reporting. So that's a really important point to remember, that you can simultaneously have abundance of outlets, abundance of voices, and a shortage of reporting. And I think that to come back to the topic directly of this several days, how this relates to diversity, one is that what happens in the old media still matters. And I have to say I sort of evolved a little bit on this, because at first I was thinking, well, it's horrible that things have gone backwards in terms of ownership and employment, but maybe rather than fighting that battle, let's focus on the new media, because you do have these lower barriers to entry, and let's get that right, and the rest will fade away. But one of the things we discovered, and I think Professor Waldman's research has also showed this, is that the main sources of online news in most communities is the newspaper and is the local TV station. So if the local TV station and the local newspaper are doing inferior reporting or not reflecting the real stories in a community, that's not only going to show up on TV and radio, it's not going to show up on the web. So we actually still do have to be concerned about what's on the traditional media. And secondly, that the local business models really matter. So it's one thing if you are able, if you're in a minority community, and the good news is that if you feel like there's a perspective that's not being covered by the local TV station, you now can get that up in the media. You can create your own blog, you can create your own website, you can tweet. But if you don't have a business model that enables you to hire reporters that can actually dig, you are still going to end up with a community that is undercovered. And that's why I think there is a little bit of a bifurcation now between voice and reporting, where you can actually have, in some ways, things a bit better in terms of diversity of voices, and yet worse in terms of the reporting of a community. And the problem is, you just see some of this is just not a news story. When Patch announced its efforts to roll out hyperlocal sites around the country, they said very explicitly, we are only going to target affluent suburbs of a certain size because we've done the numbers and those are the only ones that can work economically. And that's for the most part what we did. As Ernie mentioned, I've been looking a lot at the small town of Brooklyn with a mere 2.5 million people, which, by the way, makes it bigger than Boston, Washington, Atlanta, and Minneapolis combined. And the one local newspaper that they have there says explicitly in their ad packet, we pride ourselves on covering the best neighborhoods of Brooklyn. So the economics is sort of soft redlining can be and often is repeated in the blogosphere. In working on this project on Brooklyn, I started to map blogs in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn is teeming with new blogs, but if you mapped where the concentration is, it's basically in the same areas where media has always been concentrated in Brooklyn. So you still have these gaps. Now I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go through all the solutions we proposed for this, because that would eat up all the rest of our time. Maybe in the discussion we can get at it. But I think the bottom line where we came out for the report as a whole, I think, is actually the way I would put it when it comes to diversity as well. You really do have a situation where there have been so many innovations that are very positive, that really have advanced the ball beyond where things used to be. When you think about hyperlocal coverage, for instance, hyperlocal coverage, I think, actually is better than it's ever been before. You know, the traditional media markets really couldn't get down to a neighborhood level the way blogs can, even when they're not professional businesses. All the other ways that we all know about that the internet has improved things, living side by side with what I really think is a crisis in the lack of enough full-time professional journalists doing accountability reporting, both side by side. So what that means is, if we don't deal with this, we're going to have a situation where accountability of institutions remains weak. I fear that it will remain weak without people even being fully conscious of it, which is the most dangerous thing. It will be sort of a slow acceptance of lower standards. On the other hand, if we figure out ways of plugging these gaps, of filling the holes in the system that relate to accountability reporting, and we combine that with the tremendous gains that we actually have had in many areas, we could end up with the best media system that we have ever had. And I think that is true in general. I think it's true when it comes to coverage of minority communities and diversity in general. So having regaled you with very, very depressing statistics, I'm going to end on that happy note. Thank you.
I think you have a seat up here. There you go. I'm going to invite the other members of our panel to come to the fore, and I'm going to introduce each of them briefly. Bob Butler, who just took the stage, is an award-winning broadcast journalist and investigative reporter at KCBS Radio based in San Francisco. He is also Vice President of Broadcast for the National Association of Black Journalists and the author of the NABJ Television Newsroom Management Diversity Census. So I welcome Bob. I also want to recognize and welcome Henrik Rebinder, who is editor of La Opinion's editorial pages. He is a longtime journalist and has won a number of awards, including the Hispanic Media 100 and a team award from the Sociedad Interamericana de Prensa. He has written about Spanish-language media coverage for the Columbia Journalism Review and other publications as well. Also on the panel is Mark Lloyd, who is Associate General Counsel and Chief Diversity Officer for the Federal Communications Commission. Prior to assuming that position in 2009, he was Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights Education Fund, where he oversaw media and telecommunications initiative. I'm going to invite each of our panelists to respond to Steve's remarks and other issues that they may care to raise, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. So, Mark Lloyd, I know you wear multiple hats. This evening you're wearing your FCC hat, but how would you respond to both Steve's comments this evening, but also to the chapter in the report that dealt with diversity?
As a former broadcast journalist, Steve's comments this evening and the report that he led a great team on are depressing and frightening in many ways. One of the challenges that I have at the FCC is in helping the Commission come up with a useful way to act on its obligation to ensure that diversity is actually achieved in media and our telecommunications environment. And the first challenge, I think, regarding that is coming up with a good, legally actionable definition of diversity. To not dwell on a pun, diversity is not a black and white issue. It is extraordinarily complex. One of the things I think that we've been relying on at the Commission is the notion of diversity that really draws on a case that goes back to the 1940s, having to do with the monopoly of Associated Press wire service, and the language of Justice Hugo Black, who indicated that it is a First Amendment value that our policies promote the widest possible dissemination of diverse and antagonistic sources of information. That the American public, in order to make decisions about what's happening in their local communities and who to send to the White House and to Congress, they need access to a wide range of views. The way the FCC has, for many years, approached this is, in a way, very broad, understandably so. And the goal, I think, was to try to ensure that there was diversity by restricting the number of owners of television properties and radio properties, by making sure that there was a limit on the ability of newspaper owners and television or broadcast owners to own the same property in the same area. There has been, through I think, a number of court cases and a lot of attacks on that regime, a change in that way of sort of thinking about how to protect diversity, how to make sure that the goals of making sure that Americans have access to the widest possible dissemination of diverse and antagonistic sources is really achieved. And part of it has to do with a focus on diversity and not a focus on antagonistic. Some of us sort of call this a sort of confusion between diversity and variety. That you can get a lot of variety, but that does not necessarily mean that you actually have antagonistic sources competing for a different version of the story. For many years, through, I would say, at least in the late 1960s, this is how the FCC thought about diversity. As a result of the women's liberation movement, as a result of the civil rights movement, a wide variety of different commissions, Congress and others began to look at the fact that you saw very few women in roles as reporters or leading newsrooms or as anchors or making decisions as a producer about what went into the news. You saw very few minorities making those decisions. The Kerner Commission did their famous report trying to understand the relationship between media and the riots, and came up with some very clear recommendations about the importance of both hiring and ultimately ownership for minorities of different media. Well, the FCC took a clue from this and then began to change its rules in response. And this joined the earlier notions of diversity. There were the backlash against affirmative action, and to a great extent, the word diversity has become sort of conflated with affirmative action. As I've said at the FCC and would say again on this panel many times, diversity is diversity. That it is a complex set of concepts that remains important for the FCC to work on. That goal has remained, I think, important for the FCC to try to resolve, that none of those definitions are irrelevant. That if you make sure that you have all Americans with both access and the opportunities to participate actively in media and telecommunications system, I think the assumption is that that might actually provide you with a diverse set of sources of information, perhaps even antagonistic, and that perhaps even provide for the critical information needs of the American public. The challenge is we don't know that. So I think we need to find a way to both embrace a complex definition of diversity at the local level, and as Federico Suburvi reminds us on many occasions, that we need to recognize that the African American community is itself diverse. African Americans in Miami, who may have just come from Cuba, have a very different set of interests than African Americans who are in Harlem, or African Americans who are in Georgia. Latinos from Puerto Rico may have a very different set of interests than Mexicanos, who may have a very different set of interests than folks who, frankly, just came from Spain and speak Spanish. The diversity of the Latino community is not necessarily served by one source or two sources of diversity in the community. The same can be said for the extraordinarily diverse Asian American population. There's no way that a Mandarin language paper is going to serve the needs of the Hmong community. The notion that diversity includes only able-bodied, I think, would be not quite sensical, and we need to make sure that we are taking consideration, as my friend Karen Peltz-Strauss would remind us, of the fact that people need to be able to have access to video description services and enhanced closed captioning services. That diversity needs to include their views and their very clear, different set of issues than most of us have. So embracing a complex set of diversity, a complex understanding of the idea of diversity, is, I think, the first goal. New Americans have a diverse set of interests and understanding than Americans, even African Americans who've been here for a couple of centuries. It's another set of diversity in terms of things we need to think about. If I have a challenge with the work that Steve did, the fact that he was not able to include all of these ideas in his section on diversity, I guess I'd forgive him that a little bit. But this really is part of the work, and it really has been an honor to be able to work with you, Ernie, and the team of folks that you've been able to bring together, and and that Adam initiated, and that Carola really got going in D.C. and then again here, to be able to use new and complementary social science so that we can better understand our diversity, and then to begin to sort of focus in on what role does the government really have in making sure that all Americans really have access to the critical information that they need in order to respond to emergencies, to public safety, to a wide variety of things that that we face. And what do we do if we know there's a new flu epidemic? Who does the recent Somali immigrant trust regarding information that's being provided. What are they relying on? And if they don't get the information from a source that they trust and they don't get the flu shot, does that have an impact on other people in the community? And that sort of goes to one of the things that you've written about the inclusion and exclusion impact of the concept of diversity. So we are really just beginning to wrestle with this. And I think I heard a colleague, Tom Glazer, sort of complain about the fact that this was a 700-page report, and I think I'd probably add another 500 pages with all these complexities. But with that, I think we have some real work to do. I will say this in ending, and that is that I really think the first time the FCC is doing two extraordinarily, maybe three extraordinarily important things. The first is regarding the National Broadband Plan, working with NTIA to really understand which Americans have access, whether access is occurring on a reasonable and timely basis, what are the challenges regarding low-income Americans and their adoption of broadband. We have done real hard research and social science to begin to understand some of these issues, to the consternation of a number of folks. This FCC, for the first time, has found that broadband is not being deployed on a reasonable and timely basis, and we're taking steps to try to do a good thing to correct those sorts of challenges. Tom Reed has taken over the Office of Communications and Business Opportunities and really has put on a number of extraordinarily important workshops, almost holding the hands of folks who are trying to figure out how do they find capital to really participate in the industry in an effective way. That work is, I think, been extraordinarily important. And the only other thing that I would say about the work of the FCC is that we are more public than I think we've ever been. We've had more public workshops, more things are online, there are blogs, so we even, I think, had a Twitter account at one point in time that was relatively popular. And we are asking questions in all of these public proceedings and hearings that, frankly, we have not asked in a clear way before to try to get at some of these important issues. But as an agency, we work only as well as our public pushes us to work. So we're looking forward very much to your input. Thank you for the opportunity.
Enrique?
I think that Steven has done a perfect description of what is a newsroom, or what the newsroom has been gone through, and it's quite depressing because basically we are depending from outside instead of sending reporters or sending people inside. We are waiting for the press release, for the organizations to come, and actually the editorial boardrooms meetings has become part of information, and not only as it used to be only for the sharing of ideas. I like also from Mark the description of diversity, especially when he went into Latinos, because we have from language, even is the different expressions, the different areas, the different social economics, and I would add the difficult political voices and the different angles. Each city has their own universe, and each community is a part of the universe, and cities, they have 2-3 different universes which they have to operate, and usually the media, be radio, be newspapers, be the TV, they only focus in the main group. So they are the voices of second groups, which we can talk about Los Angeles here. The voices, we hear the Mexican voices because that's a 90-something%, but then the Guatemalan and the Salvadorian and the different groups that they come with their own initiatives and their own things, sometimes they are not expressed there. But we are talking about the digital, the minorities and the digital thing. And when we talk to Latinos and immigrants, it's really a minority inside of a minority inside of a minority, really minority. And when I say this, is basically because when we see how many people has used internet who are immigrants and speak only Spanish, they are 35%. No? We, in La Opinión, we have an overlap approximately of 22% of people who get the paper or who read the paper and see the paper in the internet and in print. This, to compare the Latino who's born here and is English speaking, is 85%. One is 35, another 85. This is basically because of the social, economic, and education profiles. It's been said that the use of internet usually happen at work. The peaks go from 8, 9, and goes noon and different times and start falling 5 or 6. If you have a blue-collar job where you work in a construction or where you work in a mechanic or you work in other places, you are not going to have access to internet. No? So when we see, when we have this challenge, how can we fulfill this mission that we have been talking, which is the civic engagement, which is to bring information, which is to bring accountability to public officials. Well, in the internet, we have to be active, actually. In the case of La Opinión, since our readers, they are not really active in internet, we have to make them be active. So we had programs. We had the programs through all the Imprimedia group in New York, in Los Angeles, here of workshops, which we say that they are for the parents of the kids who are in the schools. There are adults, 45 years old, 50, 35, people who has never been in a computer, and we teach them as a free thing. It's a whole advertising thing. Somebody put the computers and somebody put this, and it's a whole package, because it's not just for love to art and the whole thing. It's a marketing thing. But we had 100 people, the group, and we had another 100 waiting out for people who wanted to come and who wanted to be engaged in the digital things, to learn how to open an email, how to do a Word document, just the basic things. No? So this is a challenge, to bring, if we want to use the internet as a common way of communication, this is not working now for us, for our readers, for the Latinos, the immigrants from Los Angeles. No, this is not working. So we try on the paper, but the paper also has all the limitations that we have been talking. That has been the reduction in news hall. We had the reduction, of course, of journalists. We don't have an education beat permanent anymore. We don't have the city hall. We have the reporter du jour who jumps in different things and try to handle in the best way. No, so we try to work in the engagement in this way. But also, there is issues that we have. We don't do very much well work because we don't have the space and the resources, but also TV and radio. They have the same problems, and they have worse problems, because basically entertainment and radio, talk radio in Spanish. I don't know if anybody has heard the talk radio in Spanish, but the FCC would be very interesting to have a translation of the things. We always say that the FCC don't get the translation. This is why they allow a lot of things that you never imagined in English being said in the morning radios in Spanish, the talk shows. So we, really, when we talk civic engagement, and civic engagement means for immigrants many times to explain them from the beginning the system, how it works here and how you go to a school and how you do two different things. But now, for example, we had the redistricting committee of Los Angeles had new maps. Don't know if you're all aware, and maybe probably are very upset about this, especially if you live around Silver Lake. But what has happened is that we did a story, we did boardroom meetings, we did things, but things have not come out so much in TV and in radio. So we had with the commission, the La Opinión has to be sponsored for next Friday, a roundtable, Hispanic roundtable of media. So they come there in a friendly environment. We're hopeful that they think it's a friendly environment. But to come there so the commission can do a presentation about the importance for Latino. Because in the first round of hearings of public hearings for the commission, there were no Latinos almost. No? So in this time that they really need the feedback of the community, of stakeholders there, so they are having issues because minorities, because Latino Spanish media does not give so much importance to this thing. And we, as a paper, 85 years old here, we have a tradition of involving politics. And sometimes they think that we're boring. But that's sometimes what you have to do. When you cannot put only Banda and Tigres del Norte and things in the cover, and soccer. So I think basically the landscape is very complicated. It's very complicated because we have in here, it could be here, like it could be in Miami, could be in New York, in Chicago, a big sector of the population who was not really engaged, and the media that they have is not, have gone through all these cuts and sacrifices. They don't have the resources. And also, they are really back in the bus, really back in the digital gap, So I just want to close with this thing just to give a perspective of how it's a challenge for Latino and immigrant media in Spanish here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Bob, what's the good news?
The good news is I'm here and not in D.C. where it's cold. Okay. Listening to Steve talk about all the bad news, for somebody who works in a newsroom, I've experienced the reduction in personnel, but actually that happened to us back in like '91 when Westinghouse bought CBS. And so they said, overnight you got to have a bigger profit margin, and all of our freelancers went away. The lack of beat reporters, investigative reporters. We have a bureau. I work at KCBS Radio. We have a bureau in Oakland, but there's nobody ever there. Nobody is assigned there. So we just kind of use it when people are in town. We don't do hardly any investigative reporting. Now, ironically, I actually was part of CBS corporate diversity. I was corporate HR. And in 2006, they began laying off staff, and see you later. And I probably could have gone back to the newsroom at KCBS, but I said I've been there 25 years, so I decided not to go back, and it allowed me to do something that so far has been the most rewarding work of my life, and that was to help investigate the death of a colleague named Chauncey Bailey. We started the Chauncey Bailey Project, and I worked on that. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but Chauncey was a journalist, the editor of the Oakland Post. He was working on a story about your black Muslim bakery in Oakland, and before his story could come out, he was shot and killed. And we believe it was the people from the bakery had him killed, and in the end, the head of the bakery, one of his henchmen, and the triggerman all got convicted. The first two are doing life without parole for 3 murders. 3 murders for the leader and 2 for the other guy. And the guy that pulled the trigger on Chauncey and another man got 25 years for testifying. Any individual station or newspaper in the Bay Area could not have done the work that we did. They just don't have the manpower. Neither were they going to commit the manpower to follow the story. I mean, the first time this was done in this country was back in '76 when Don Bowles was killed in Arizona. So that project, that collaborative journalism, did what people individually could not do. So also because I was laid off, I had the opportunity now to do more volunteer work, and I joined the board of the National Association of Black Journalists. And back in 2004, there was a meeting between the networks and the 4 groups, the black journalists, Hispanic journalists, Native American journalists, Asian American journalists, about diversity, because a report had come out the year before that talked about how the diversity had continued to decline in television and radio. This was the Radio Television News Directors Association report that's done by Hofstra and Bob Papper. So RTNDA brokers this meeting. So one of the first questions, and I wasn't at the meeting, one of the first questions we had was, well, we're going to talk about diversity and helping you increase your numbers. What are your numbers? What are the numbers like? And the networks politely declined to give the information. When Don Imus got in trouble for the Rutgers basketball team, our president at the time met with Les Moonves of CBS. He said, you know, we'd asked you for these numbers a couple years ago. We never got them. I'll send them right over. They never arrived. And that summer, I had a conversation with the VP of diversity for CBS who said, we're not going to give you those numbers. Nobody else is, so why should we? And I'm thinking, wow, that's, you know, I mean, we're trying to help, but you don't want to give us, it's like, I call it the $10 rule. If I'm trying to buy something for $10 and I got $5 in my pocket, I know I need $5 to buy what I want to buy. If I know what your diversity is, then I know what I have to do to help you. If I don't know what it is, I don't know what I have to do to help you. So we started doing our annual diversity census report. In that, the first year we looked at the stations owned by ABC, CBS, Fox, and NBC. Collectively, 61 stations, and at the end of the report, there were 61 people of color in management. Not African Americans, but Hispanics, Asians, and, well, there were no Native Americans in the first report. 61, that's one per station. Doesn't sound too bad, until you realize that 17 of the stations had nobody of color in management in such, you know, cities as Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, and 23 had one person of color. So we said, wow, look at this. So we released the report, got no attention, and every year we've added more companies and more stations. So 2011, we had 228 stations owned by 15 different companies, and it's about 11% of the managers are people of color. Now you ask, why does that matter? If you reflect the diversity of your community, and you do some people were outraged. Why are you going to put a 4-year-old boy on saying he wants to have a gun? It's just going to scare people. If you see that clip, you think the kid's going to be a gangbanger. What the station edited out of the kid's comments was, because I'm going to be a policeman. Kind of changes the context of what the kid said, doesn't it? So I wrote the story. I actually did 3 stories on that for Dory Maynard, for the Maynard Institute. The video, as of right now, has got almost 250,000 hits. People are looking at this video. And Congressman Bobby Rush's office called me because they wanted to know, well, how'd you get the story, you know, to tell us about this. So we ended up doing a workshop at the CBC Legislative Weekend in September, and they asked us to release the full diversity census report. Because in talking with them, they were, well, what about the diversity in Chicago at this station? I said, well, there is none. Not one person of color in management. And they took issue with that. It's important to have this kind of data because until now, nobody knew. Even the RTNDA report, it's a survey. He sends out surveys and he gets somebody back and they base their data on the survey. The American Society of News Editors does an annual diversity report. They send out surveys and they get so many back. Ours is the only one that is actually an actual census. For every station, I can give you a name of a person in every position. It's very valuable information to know that. So I think it's important to have that information so that if something happens, you can go back to them. And believe it or not, some of these companies don't even know what their numbers are. Because I've had more than one come to me and tell me that I was wrong. That no. And when I get through telling them the names that I have for the different stations and the different people, the pregnant pause is priceless. I even had one guy who told me I was wrong when I said, well, isn't this your general manager? Isn't this your news director? And every time I'd ask a name, the pause would get longer. And in the end, I said, well, I had the same information on all your stations. Well, but your criteria is wrong. The criteria is the criteria. So one of my friends who works for this company actually called me and told me before I released the information, you can't do that, that's wrong. Afterwards, they called me and said, wow, that was a wake-up call. We had no idea. Companies themselves don't know how much diversity they don't have. And, you know, I can tell you how to increase it, but it's got to be a commitment on your part. You know, people, when I talked to my news directors when I was diversity director, I would say, well, you know, what about your diversity? Well, I'd like to have more, but I can't find qualified people. Anybody ever heard that? You can't find qualified people? And I said, well, where are you looking? Well, I don't really have time to look. I'm so busy. But when HR goes out to a job fair, they bring me the resumes, and the resumes aren't very good. Well, I mean, I worked in corporate HR. And I can tell you that my news director, one of them specifically told me, Bob, I love the fact that you're there. I said, why? Because you work in a newsroom. You know what this is about. HR has never worked in a newsroom. They've never sat outside the mayor's house for 3 hours, holding it in because you can't get to the bathroom. I mean, it's a different dynamic to actually work in a newsroom. So I look at somebody's resume and I see a different thing than the HR person does. That's one of the reasons why we don't have the diversity that we need. The other reason is, for management, I'll be perfectly honest, if you go to any J school in this country and you talk to the students, 80% of them want to be on TV. And there's about 25,000 a year that are graduating with degrees in broadcast journalism. And that's at least 5,000 people that might want to work as a producer and eventually get into management. So it's not just the industry's fault. We have to look at our schools, we have to look at organizations like NABJ, which is now trying to train people to get into management. We started something called our Executive Suite, which is designed to train not just the managers who are going up, but the managers who are coming in. Because we have to help, our part is to help you find qualified people. Most of the time I get phone calls from people, Bob, I'm looking for an assistant news director, I'm looking for a producer. In fact, I'm looking for one now, to work in one of our, I shouldn't say one of, I keep saying one of ours, I ain't worked there in 5 years, for a station in Boston. People call NABJ because I've told them my message to you is, give me a call. I cannot guarantee you that I can find somebody for you. But if I do, you'll have somebody. I can guarantee you if you don't call that I can't help you. And that's kind of where things are. So this report, to me, turned out to be a great resource, and I'm actually gearing up to do the 2012, which will now have close to 300 stations by, I think, 17 different companies. And we're going to keep on building.
And you and I have talked a little bit about the ways we can involve some of our students, perhaps as interns and researchers, on the good work that you're doing. We don't have a lot of time left, but I would like to open it up to questions. I'm sure, Felix, I see you back there. I'm sure you've got a question for us.
I'd like to
Felix Gutierrez, one of our distinguished faculty.
Feeding off of what was just said, what is stopping the FCC from right now reinstituting the 395 forms in which stations reported their gender and racial makeup by job category across all licensees, not just broadcast licensees, but looking at the digital. We had that for many years. You wouldn't have to do all the work you do. It gave us a way to take the temperature. The FCC pulled it back during the deregulation area. Now we're hearing a lot of more positive talk from the FCC. It'd be nice to be seeing some positive action. So what's stopping the FCC from just reinstituting that?
Those forms were challenged in court. They were viewed essentially as a pressure on stations to hire more minorities, and frankly without the justification. So part of what it is that we are working on is being able to determine whether, and with evidence that we might be able to take before the court, to be able to say it actually makes a difference that you have women and people of color and the disabled in these stations. They have an impact on providing critical information needs to a wide variety of different communities that the station is licensed to serve. We don't have that information now. We're getting there. The data collection that the FCC is trying to improve has been a form that's 393 without trying to get too technical on things, just trying to understand in the first instance who actually owns that station. But this is very important information. The fact of the matter is, if we collected that information, we would have to go to court to explain why we are asking stations this information. That would be the court, or folks would argue this would be a burden on the stations to provide that information. That it creates, again, a pressure on stations to hire certain numbers of women and minorities. And that if we're going to do that, we have to have the justification to do it. perhaps we can find the reasons for doing it, and we can begin proceeding to reinstitute. But we're not quite there yet.
Is there a public interest justification?
Well, we don't know. We would again there's a possibility that there is a public interest justification, but as it stands right now, the court is saying there is no established connection between ownership and employment and what's provided to the local community. What the court is saying, and right now the argument is that the economics will determine what service the communities get. It doesn't matter, the gender or race or any other sort of status of the owners or the management of the operation, that those folks will provide information that the community needs because they have an economic incentive to do that. So until we have got better information that suggests that rationale is not quite right, then I think unfortunately we're in a position where the FCC is not going to be able to collect that information. But I would also say this. Administrations change. Even bureaucratic agencies in the government change. What is collected, what's not collected, and what's relied upon shifts. I would argue that it is very important for the FCC to collect all relevant information about what's happening with their licensees and whether or not the communities that are supposed to serve those or be served by those licensees are actually being served. With that said, I think it's also extraordinarily important for RTNDA, for other independent analysts, for academics and others to do independent, non-government funded or sponsored research to find out what's happening in their own communities or in the industries that they care about. It is important to have this information, if only to challenge the government's arguments, and the government can use this information as well. So the degree to which we have independent information looking at this stuff remains valuable.
Well, you've come to the right place.
Yes.
Deborah Lanford.
So in December there was a. Thank you.
So in December there was an article in the LA Times that interviewed Michael Copps, the FCC commissioner stepping down. And he said that he was really concerned about diversity from the aspect that there was a reduced number of media owners, and he actually went so far to say they're basically the same guy. So my question to you is, was there any dialogue at the FCC after that? I mean, here you have a commissioner saying something so important about that, and then with regards to the report and in terms of early adoption of internet for diverse communities, I would argue that they do adopt early and they set trends, because it may not be on the computer, but the texting is very clear, the mobile devices are very clear, and when you talk about 25% of the African American audience is tweeting, that's why the number one show that's tweeted about is actually Basketball Wives on the planet. So, but why doesn't that translate to a bigger, investment in that community? But I want to know about if there was any pushback on Michael Copps' statement.
Well, let me say that former chairman, acting chairman Michael Copps is a friend, and I will miss him at the Federal Communications Commission. The most recent notice of proposed rulemaking in the media ownership proceeding, quadrennial review, 2010 quadrennial review, does ask a set of questions that Commissioner Copps pushed the commission to answer about ownership and diversity, and see if we could do a better job of getting hard information about ownership and about the relationship between ownership and services to local communities. So that question is out. In part, we are here to work with folks in the academic community to begin to try to find ways to, what are the appropriate ways to address that set of questions. So there's, I don't think there's any question about, Mike Copps and Commissioner Clyburn. Their concerns about these things have been heard, and with my colleagues, Jonathan Levy, who is with the Office of Strategic Planning, and an economist who keeps us in line, and Tom Reed, who runs the Office of Communications and Business Opportunities. They're working on these things as well, and so these are important things. The FCC does not have the information that we need to make intelligent policy, and we're looking for help to try to get that information. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
For organizations that utilize human resources, hello. There we go. For organizations that utilize human resources to assist in the effort to diversify their workforce, what recommendations do you have for those in human resources to partner with the subject matter experts in journalism in order to actually get you relevant candidates?
Bob, that sounds like a question.
If you're in HR and you're going to a career fair and you, especially for journalism, what I would say is take one of your hiring managers with you, because they're the ones that can look at that resume and know instantly if I want to talk to this person or not. When an HR person looks at a resume and they basically look at, okay, this person was at this job for 3 years, and they were at this job for 3 years, and at that job for 2 years, and that looks great. I'll look at the same resume and I'll say, okay, this person got their first job out of college as a PA in Peoria, and then they went and became a PA in New Orleans, and stayed there for 3 years. And then now they're a PA in LA for 3 years. What that tells me is this person is just market hopping. There's not a progression. Contrary, here's somebody who has a resume and it says that they got their first job as a PA in Peoria. They stayed there for 2 years. They got their next job as a reporter in New Orleans. They stayed there for 2 years, and now they're in Pittsburgh as an anchor, and they're there for 2 years. So you have same people that have 5 years experience. I would not hire the first one because they're just market jumping to get up. This other person's being promoted up. That's what you're looking for. That's the kind of thing you have to know. And if you're in HR, and in journalism, you might be able to figure that out. But if nobody's told you, and in my experience where I was, they ain't gonna tell you anything. You have to figure it out on your own. So that's what I would say. Take somebody with you or talk to them. If you bring them a resume, say, what do you think of this? And they say, I'm interested. Why not? You got to find out why it is. Eventually they'll tell you what they're looking for. But until you know that, you're not going to be much help to them.
I'm going to call one out, but let me raise one. I'm going to liven it up a little bit. It's late, so we're talking with our colleagues who have come all the way from Washington, from the FCC, and we really are very appreciative of that, to engage in kind of a genuine dialogue. But in the conversation, it says, well, we're constrained because the court won't let us do this, and then the Congress will stop us there, and then the industry groups have a different position. So it's like, what's with the FCC? Are we sort of, for those of us who are really interested in moving this issue forward, or maybe moving it backwards to where there was greater commission attention to this, or congressional. So are we just sort of wasting our time as professors in talking to the FCC if the real action is going to take place in Congress and the courts? And why? So, Steve, you've sort of been on the inside and the outside, and now you're on the outside. So let me ask you that impertinent question.
Well, it is true that the folks at the FCC are constantly making a judgment based on policy considerations, political considerations, and whether they're going to get overturned in the court. And it's a practical. I think it's a practical reality when they I in fact had this experience as a non-lawyer, and I was coming up with all sorts of bright ideas. I thought we were going to save the universe and save the media. And 9 out of 10 of them, I always said, that's a great idea, would be found unconstitutional in 10 seconds. Good idea. We'd go. That would take down the entire apparatus of media regulation if you go for that. And so, it's you do curb your sails. No, wait, what's the metaphor? You do trim your sails. A little
Curb
bit.
your enthusiasm, trim your sails.
and on the grounds that you have a limited number of shots, you had a limited amount of time, and so it's a natural human thing to not take your shots on the things where you think you're going to lose and where your effort's going to be wasted, and focus on things that you think are going to work. Now, there is, I think, implicit in your question is like if you do that too much, you never push the envelope. You never try to get the rules overturned. You never try to change the argument. So you can get too much in a bunker where you're acting defensively about everything and not, don't want to do anything that might get overturned. And, I think, I don't know, most of what the FCC does is still mysterious to me. I think that on a couple of issues they've been more aggressive than on other issues, on the open internet, for instance, which I think is one of the chairman's #1 issues. They went out with a position that they thought was the right position, even though a lot of lawyers told them it's going to get overturned, but they said this is the right thing to do. So I guess I would say they do that sometimes, but maybe not on everything. Maybe they're picking their battles. But that's kind of, you're not wrong. It's just that's the reality of the sort of triage that goes on when you're deciding how do you spend your day and how do you spend your political capital.
Okay. We'll take 2 more quick questions. One here and then Al. You, sir, go first and then Al.
Just had a question about the broadcast renewal licensing renewal system, and why not use that renewal system or to reformulate it or amend it to what really has teeth to promote diversity. Now I know one big hurdle is the First Amendment, and at least with the content side, it's considered content regulation. But in exchange for this license, these broadcasters, licensees get this license that's worth billions of dollars, and in exchange supposed to serve the public interest. So why not use the license renewal system that really has some teeth of reformulating to really promote diversity?
Okay, let's get the final question here, and we'll take 2 questions at once. Pass it all the way down. Or,
okay.
Oh, you've got a microphone. Okay.
Yeah, it's on testing. It doesn't matter. I can speak louder. I'm a professor. So let me see if I got this straight. Steve started out saying that there's a problem because the diversity we were expecting to get with the new media is not possibly there, because a lot of the existing companies are the ones that are practicing or have access to the new media. And then we hear that there's a problem with the diversity within the workplace of those organizations, which may in fact have an impact on how much diversity you actually do get if you finally do rely on the new media. And then we hear that the FCC is sort of limited in terms of what it can do to address the workplace, which then has an impact on the corporations, which then have an impact on the new media. Am I right that that's what we're supposed to take from this?
Steve, you want to try that one?
Yeah, one of the dilemmas of the report is we kept coming up with all sorts of problems that didn't have an FCC solution. And the normal thing is, like, you approach problems and you assume that, why write about it if you don't have an FCC solution or a solution at hand? And we decided, actually, there's some value in just pointing out what the problem is, even if this particular agency doesn't have the solution. So what we did in the report is there were a couple things we talked about that were directly within the FCC's purview. There's a few other things that were in the government's purview. And then there were other things that are things that journalism schools have to do and foundations have to do. And I think I think the reality is, to take the example of the new media, I do think that new media still holds great potential for solving a lot of these problems, but it needs to have more money from foundations. It needs to have journalism schools actively engaged. It has to have the IRS not putting roadblocks in the way of nonprofit media being established. So there are 4 or 5 very concrete big things that could happen that could really help. They just don't happen to be things that the FCC can do. So while we are declaring powerlessness on some of this, it's not to say that there aren't things that can be done. And I want to mention one thing that the FCC can do, and it relates a little bit to the question about license renewal, and maybe Mark or the others will talk about what role minority hiring might have in it. But one of the things, we looked at that issue a lot in this report of the public interest obligation. And the problem is that you do have a little bit of a dilemma of that if you get very granular in saying, in order to have a license be renewed, you have to do a certain amount of news and public affairs, you then do have the FCC getting in the position of defining what counts as legitimate news and public affairs. Local news, okay. Oprah, she covers pretty good stuff. Judge Judy, she's covering, some serious issues. Where do you draw the line? And you have the issue, you have the FCC. You might like who's there at the FCC now. What happens when it changes and someone you don't like is making those judgments? So, so what we ended up emphasizing in the report was a little bit of a different approach. We say, okay, we've tied ourselves in knots for 50 years or 75 years trying to figure out ways of taking away people's licenses on the grounds of them not doing programming we don't like. In fact, there have been more than 100,000 license renewals in the last 75 years, and there have been only 4 cases of a station not being renewed on public interest grounds, and none in the last 30 years. And it's not only FCC's negligence, it's also because the constitutional issues do make it rather difficult. So we said, and this was controversial, there were definitely people who thought we wimped out on this, but we sort of said instead of batting our head against the wall for another 20 years and trying to do the same thing, what's the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result? Why don't we try something different? So we emphasized disclosure. Right now, there is an ongoing proceeding at the FCC that, as a just an example, says TV stations collect an absolute treasure trove of information about political campaign advertising. More information in some ways than goes to the Federal Election Commission. It includes state races, local races, federal races, and we said, okay, this isn't exactly tough stuff compared to forcing them to do a certain number of hours, but it could be really useful, and it's not very burdensome. The broadcasters have come out in full bore against this. Mind you, this is stuff they already collect, and all the FCC is suggesting is that stuff that you collect and put on pieces of paper, you should now put on this thing we just discovered called the Internet, and they are opposing that. And I should point out also that Univision is opposing it, NBC is opposing it, all the networks, as well as many of the local station groups, are opposing it. The idea that news organizations are taking the lead in opposing transparency, opposing political transparency and opposing media transparency is appalling. And it's a very concrete thing that can be done right now that would be a way that stations could actually earn the use of the airwaves that they're getting from taxpayers.
So I'm going to stop it here.
Well, I wanted to answer that.
I know, that's right. But we've sort of gone about 45 minutes. So we've gone well over.
But the captive audience, they don't want to leave.
We'll say, all right, you got the last 2 responses. I'm going to, so go ahead.
I'm Prince, so you no airway for me.
I would only say this. I think I mentioned Section 706 and mapping the deployment of broadband. This was a provision put in the 1996 Telecommunications Act. 1996 Telecommunications Act. It was not declared until 2010 that deployment was not occurring on a reasonable and timely basis. 1996, 2010. The fact that we were able to gather the information about what was actually happening in local communities is the reason that the chairman of the FCC was able to address his main set of concerns about broadband internet deployment and net neutrality. We need the information about what's happening in local communities. You can rely, if you want, on the federal government and forums to get all the information, but again, you get a different FCC. The information about broadband deployment is probably not as transparent as it ought to be about what's happening in local communities, but there are local groups gathering their own information about what's going on that can continue to challenge any finding that it's happening on a reasonable basis. You can take that to court. We have this general notion that diversity would be good. And we've followed that general notion for a number of years. We do not have the evidence that it makes any good, hard difference. And we can make arguments one way or the other. I believe, as we've been talking, that there are models of social science that will help us reasonably understand what's happening in local communities and to determine whether diversity really does make a difference. Imagine if we had that evidence at the FCC, then we could act in a way regarding license renewals. We could do something about collecting better information about who owns what and who's employed in management. But before you make policy, you need evidence and information, not only for the courts, but just to make policy. And I don't think you want this FCC or any other FCC making policy frankly, without your input from the academic community and from the journalists that are finding out what's going on in that community to say, listen, you may think all this is a really good idea, but what's really going to work are more low-power radio stations. You may think this is a good idea, but what really is going to make a difference are really effective white spaces policy so that people can use spectrum in the way they're not using it before. You may think this stuff about media is good, but what you really need is a new technology called cognitive radio that will let us have, everybody can have a license. But the first thing is to see if we can start in a way that we've not started before, which is to find out what's actually happening in your local community. I mean, let's make policy based on that, right? Not based on a theory about this or that. And so the questions that we are asking are questions that we've not asked before. I would suggest that you take those questions very seriously. And that we're a new approach on this. We do not consider ourselves powerless, but we do consider ourselves subject to the will of the American public as expressed by Congress and the courts. And so don't give up. I know it's hard. We're not there yet, but we're on our way.
Thank you.
Real quickly, I got to say, when you asked the question, I wanted to ask Mark that same question about license renewals. Did you know to get your license renewed at a broadcast station, the application is 5 pages. Aside from putting the name of the station, the address, the frequency, the rest of the questions are yes and no. Did you broadcast in the public interest? Did you violate any FCC policies? I mean, it's too simple. These broadcast licenses are licenses to print money. There was back, I think it was in the early 90s, this one broadcaster said, there's a quote in a textbook when I taught broadcast news up at SF State last semester. He said, I could run color bars on my station between my commercials and still make money. Did you know that when radio first started, at KCBS Radio in San Jose, it was called FN and San Jose Calling. We were the first broadcast radio station in the world. That the reason they played music was not to entertain the audience. It was to fill the time between the commercials. That's true. License renewals for television, for broadcast stations, are now done every 8 years. 2013 is a license renewal year. So if anybody wants to do any mischief, for instance, if WBBM, which put that video on, if somebody wanted to challenge their license in 2013, that would really catch somebody's attention. In fact, the third story I did in this series of stories, I talked to Congressman Rush's office, and his communications director said, you know, it's been years since the FCC has challenged the license, has failed to renew a license. And putting that information in that story prompted a huge reaction at CBS. My good friend, the senior VP for diversity, ended up going to that station. They conducted an investigation, and to this day, nobody has been disciplined. The station has not apologized and has not corrected the record.
I told you we should have stopped earlier. But I really, let's really thank our panel for an incredibly useful and informative, thank you, group. And stay in touch. The Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism will continue to do this kind of work and still continue to focus on issues of diversity. And we look forward to seeing you at the next forum. Thank you very much.